Good evening from our headquarters. This is This Sunday Show at Hromadske International, the only prime-time program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Hromadske. And of course, these days we are remembering the 5 years of the annexation of Crimea, and we have a chance to talk to my colleague, Simon Ostrovsky. 5 years ago, Simon, everybody watched Simon's reports from Crimea back then during the annexation. He used to be the reporter for the Vice News, later followed the reporting from the war-torn east of Ukraine, and was also famous for his report Selfie Soldiers, which had proven that Russian citizens were fighting in the Ukrainian territory. Currently, Simon is a freelance reporter, but also working here in Ukraine for PBS NewsHour. So, Simon, great to have you here.
Thanks for the invitation.
So hard to imagine that it's already 5 years, and I think that we couldn't believe 5 years ago that we would sit and speak about the occupation of Crimea 5 years afterwards. My question is really, you put a lot of reporters, and you in particular, put a lot of effort to prove back then that it was an annexation. Still, for such a long time, there were so many doubts. Why do you think it was so complicated to explain to the global audience that things are very important and the reaction was so slow?
Well, I think you have to understand what happened in Crimea was totally unprecedented. No country, as far as I can remember, at least in modern history, has had the audacity to conduct a secret operation the way that Russia annexed Crimea. I mean, usually when you have a secret operation, you think of, some special forces soldiers wearing ski masks, without any identifying markers on their uniforms, blasting in through a window, capturing or killing somebody, and then getting out of there as quickly as possible. And it's probably like a small group of people. That's your traditional secret mission. In the case of Crimea, you had thousands of soldiers who all took off their flag patches and all took off their name patches, participating in an operation that didn't happen in a day, but took place over a period of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It was hard to imagine that a country could seriously try to do an operation of this scale and not take responsibility for it. Eventually they did. Months later, Vladimir Putin himself gave an interview to a Russian television channel and said, yes, this was, a Russian operation, and so on and so forth. But in the first weeks and months after it had happened, it was poker face. Wasn't our guys. We weren't involved. Not a single Russian soldier was there. Didn't happen. And I think this was a very effective strategy in terms of confusing people by giving the Russians, they gave themselves the plausible deniability that they needed to make the rhetorical argument that they hadn't occupied or annexed anything.
But there are sanctions in place. However, it still feels here 5 years afterwards that it's way too little. The things were happening, like the Western reaction was too late. Do you think there is clear understanding of the Western community of what had happened there and like the strategy? Because today when we listen, anything said like, we understand it would take years and years and this issue probably won't be resolved ever.
Well, it depends on what your time scale is. If you look at the occupation of the Baltic states in the post-war period by the Soviet Union, the international community never recognized that they were part of the Soviet Union. And so how many years passed between 1945, the end of the war, and the collapse of the Soviet Union when those states became, independent, not just from a de facto standpoint, but from an actual standpoint. Sometimes these things are decades in the making. I can see a situation where Crimea might spend a very, very long time under the control of the Kremlin and the Russian government. But you can even take a step back even further than, let's say, the post-war to the end of the Soviet Union period. What if you looked at it from the perspective of, the Russian Empire? The Russian Empire used to be much bigger than modern-day Russia. It included Poland, it included Finland. Then the Russian Revolution happened, and you had the Soviet Union, but it already didn't include those territories, but it still included Central Asia and Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe. Now, the Russia of today doesn't even include Belarus or Ukraine or Central Asia, so it's shrinking even further. And I think if we look at the trajectory of the Russian Empire from that perspective, then we see a Russian Empire that is shrinking slowly and slowly. Every once in a while, maybe a little piece here like Crimea or there gets added. But the overall trend is of a shrinking Russia, and I think that's a trend that nobody in Moscow, no one person, even Vladimir Putin, can reverse.
From your reporting, what were probably the most striking moments when you were reporting, in particularly during the annexation, and in particular on the day of the so-called referendum, which some of the media still refer as something which could be questioned, could be discussed?
I think the issue of the referendum is a little bit overwrought. You know, people bring it up and they say, well, you know, even if the referendum wasn't observed by international observers, don't you think people would have voted to separate from Ukraine in a fair vote? And for me, that's kind of besides the point. You know, you can gerrymander a referendum anywhere to get the desired result that you would want. I mean, I think viewers in America really understand how gerrymandering works. That's when you draw your own borders around a certain area to get the desired voter effect. And that's essentially what you got with Crimea. The Russian authorities drew an arbitrary border around Crimea, said this is going to be the only part of Ukraine that's going to participate in this vote. They found an area that was predominantly ethnically Russian, and they organized a referendum there. The results were predictable. That's why Ukraine has a law that says referendums are supposed to be across the board, across the entire country, not in specific regions that you gerrymander to fit the result that you want. I mean, in Russia, they don't organize referendums for the separation of, say, Chechnya or Tatarstan or Bashkortostan or Kalmykia or Buryatia or any other region that has a Russian minority that might vote to separate from Russia. Why doesn't that happen in Russia and it can happen in Crimea? That's the question that people should be asking.
I'd probably add, because back then we had a lot of discussions on the conferences and seminars where the questions was raised, and then Ukrainian sociologists had kind of said that, you know, before 2014 there was never ever a moment that statistically there were more than 50% of the Ukrainians in Crimea, Ukrainian citizens, who kind of wanted to separate. So there was not even a reason, like just from the polls, to consider that that would be an issue. Following then, you mentioned the world referendum was staged, yet later we had Brexit referendum, yet later we had a lot of, you know, like the way we expected, the Ukrainians expected how the West should react, and international community kind of changed. Now we are preoccupied with Brexit, with Trump, and a lot of other things. How do you feel, where do you see the whole issue of annexation and the war in Ukraine in the global history? How do you see these things are connected? Because we do have this feeling.
Well, there was Brexit, but there was also the Scottish referendum as well, which had a pretty different result. And you can see that when a referendum like the Scottish one took place, there was months and months of preparation in advance, and people had a lot of time to consider it. Whereas the so-called referendum in Crimea took place in a matter of days, and it wasn't even sure how they were counting the votes. But you can sort of look at the events in Crimea as a beginning of this authoritarian populist wave that seems to be sweeping parts of the world right now. You had the Brexit referendum, you had the election of Donald Trump in the United States, you've got the Yellow Vest protests in France right now, and it's possible to look at this as part of one phenomenon of sort of illiberal, anti-democratic, populist wave of movements that seem to be more and more successful around the world. And for those of us who were here in Ukraine and saw it at the time, we sort of got a sneak preview of what was going to be happening in the rest of the world, even though we didn't realize it at the time.
Your investigation on selfie soldiers had proven that there were Russian soldiers as far as away from Buryatia coming to fight in Debaltseve. Your particular reports had proven that there were Russian troops. However, still we feel and hear the constant denial of the Russian side on the international negotiations, all the discussion in Minsk, again as well, that we are not there, we hadn't been there. Do you think something has changed in the international order that it just so openly, the country has for a while denied something which is obvious and proven? As well, we can also speak, you've been covering the MH17, which kind of had become an obvious case, but still there is a denial after anything kind of Bellingcat and everybody else had done.
Well, you know, this is the strategy. It's nothing more than a strategy. It's deny, 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 and you know, hope for the best. You know, throw a Hail Mary, as we say. Basically, no matter what the evidence says, barrel forward with your own position and hope for the best. I think that's essentially Russia's foreign policy at the moment, and has been sort of for the last several years since 2013, roughly. So it's not surprising that Russians still deny involvement in the war in East Ukraine, although they've admitted their participation in Crimea, obviously, at this point. I think there's some good news, though, which is that I think most people don't actually believe the denials. You know, if you look through the media in the West, if you look through the policy of the departments of foreign affairs in Western countries, I don't think they're taking what the Russians are selling. So just because they denied, you know, it doesn't mean that we have to take them at their word, and I don't think people do.
Now there is a whole kind of, let's say, new generation of the journalists coming to Ukraine to report for 5 years afterwards. There were some of you who were there, and there are these new people coming who had never experienced. So when there was annexation in Crimea had happened, then you moved to Donetsk and to the Ukrainian Donbas. What have you seen there? How was it? How would you remember those kind of days and how the whole kind of the things were unfolding?
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate, you know, because the events that we were witnessing were truly historic. It was unbelievable. If you can imagine people who were part of one country just a few days before, completely switching to the other side, taking flags off of their buildings, taking flags off of their uniforms, and pledging loyalty to a completely new regime. We were seeing this happening in real time, and it was kind of hard to imagine that such a thing could happen. I remember being at the Gorlovka police station in the moment when crowds of people were surrounding it, throwing stones and Molotov cocktails at it. This was one of the dispatches that we were filming. And the police inside the building were defending it. Almost to the last man, they were standing there with their shields and with their riot gear, trying to fend the people off from the building, trying to hold the doors closed. And ultimately they failed because they were just, you know, outnumbered massively by the crowd of people involved in the protest. And that wasn't the most surprising part for me. The most surprising part was that immediately after the building had been taken over, the police, who had moments ago been defending the building, lined up information in the courtyard and took a new oath of allegiance to a new commander who had just taken over the building. And those sorts of things were happening all over eastern Ukraine. The situation was so fluid, you never knew which way things were going to turn in one place. And the only reason that the front line of eastern Ukraine and the areas controlled by the central government of Ukraine falls where it does today in this windy little path is because on the one side of it, there were people there who switched, and on the other side, there were people who said, no, this is going to stop here, and they decided to fight, and that's what led to the war.
How would you explain that? Were they really, I don't know, like what is just clear treason, or people were afraid, or they didn't understand it's so serious?
I think by the time we got into the conflict in eastern Ukraine, people realized it was pretty serious because the annexation of Crimea had already happened. And so they realized, things could switch sides. People were switching sides. And I think there was just a certain momentum. And some people believed that momentum was going to sweep across the country. They didn't want to get left behind, and I think they feared for their safety. And they felt that the Russian flag was on the march, and you better get in line, or you're going to get bulldozed. But that didn't happen. I think the fact that the international community stepped in and threatened sanctions had something to do with it. They stepped in with sanctions over Crimea. Russia realized that there was going to be an economic price to pay if it continued to go forward. And so a sort of uneasy stalemate developed in the east of Ukraine. But there was a moment in time when Putin was making threats about tanks rolling through the streets of Kiev, when you could really believe that was possible and that could happen.
Back then we were all talking a lot about the fake news. This was a new phenomenon. Now I think we are all very much tired of listening to that, and this term is heavily misused by the politicians, which trying to kind of underestimate any investigation against them with this term. However, how do you think what the journalists understood after all these events today, and how we also can discuss this issue of the fake news, which is misused, and sometimes it's very easy to blame?
I think what we learned is how important it is for the platforms that carry information to make sure that the information that they're carrying is of a certain quality. And I think, and what I'm talking about is the social networks, Facebook and Twitter and others, who around the time of the events in Ukraine in 2014 didn't even want to hear the argument that they carried any responsibility for the information that was carried on their platforms. The position of Facebook at the time was, we're just a vessel, we're a platform, anybody can say anything on our platform, and we're not responsible for that. Fast forward a couple of years, and you see the genocide against the Rohingya people in Myanmar taking place in large part because of fake news and information that was spread on Facebook. And you see all of the fake political ads in 2016 that were spread around on Facebook and Twitter during the presidential campaign. And you see a lot more criticism being directed at the social media, at the social networks. And so they realized that they couldn't just get away anymore with saying we're just, vessels, and what the content that pours through us has nothing to do with us. They've now started to moderate it at some level. I still think it's not at the level that it should be, but at least there's an acknowledgement that yes, we can be part of the problem as social networks, and we have to take responsibility and deal with it. And I think it's the inevitable conclusion is that there's going to be some form of government regulation, just like the government regulates radio and television. In the early days, it didn't. Now it does. Wasn't the end of the world. I think something similar is probably on the way for social media. So we learn from our mistakes, and we move forward. And I think that's probably what's happening now.
We shortly talked that 5 years after the war, and at the start of the war, both in Crimea and in the Donbass, there are people living. They have their own troubles. Of course, the number of the political prisoners are growing. However, more or less, it looks like it's very hard to report. These stories are not newsworthy. There is less interest in the West. Obviously, that's normal, even in Ukraine as well, yet it doesn't make the life of the people easier there. So how do you think, what are the things probably might be interesting, and how we as media can kind of move this story forward, that these things are not forgotten? It's not in history, it's not a history.
It's still going on, and it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one to answer for two reasons. Because journalists who want to cover the events in eastern Ukraine are stuck between two fires. On the one hand, Western countries are in political turmoil right now. So all of the journalistic resources are being spent on covering domestic affairs. People are rightly concerned about what is happening in their own countries, and they just don't have the bandwidth to spend as much time covering foreign news, okay? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, since the year 2015, the de facto authorities in eastern Ukraine have pretty much banned most Western reporters from even visiting the area. So that makes it very difficult to report. Even if you were able to convince your editor that it's a story worth doing, now you face a travel ban from the pro-Russia authorities based in Donetsk and Luhansk. There's also a third problem. And the third problem is that the status quo over there hasn't changed, so it's not really news. The status quo hasn't changed in several years. There's not all that much new to report. So it's a very difficult issue that I'm afraid I don't have the answer to.
Anyways, I should say that you can find a lot of articles and stories, human stories from occupied Crimea and on the war-torn Donbass on our webpage en.hromadske.ua. We are there. It's difficult to make these stories, but if you really would like to know what's happening, it's there, and we'll be back in a second. Another story you had a chance to follow is the one we are also looking at, is a trial of Paul Manafort, who had been here for a while, for really pretty up to 10 years, been the advisor to Ukrainian President Yanukovych, and as well later was running the election campaign of Donald Trump. To what extent, so the Ukraine and the US had been kind of connected, and now it's an important story. But how important is that? What can also the American audience still learn from Ukraine about this case?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think the Ukrainian public learned a lot more about their country from the American courts than they've learned about Ukraine from Ukrainian courts. Because as far as I can tell, Paul Manafort is one of the very few people from the Yanukovych circle that has been successfully tried and convicted, and it didn't happen in Ukraine. The revolution happened here in 2014, and it was an anti-corruption revolution where people got up into the streets and died so that reforms could happen here, and so that corrupt officials could go to jail over it, and to set out a sort of tradition of accountability. That accountability has only happened in an American court so far. That's kind of sad, if you ask me. But what we did find out is a lot of the details of the sort of corruption that was happening during the Yanukovych regime through Paul Manafort. We found out how much he was paid. We found out who he paid off. We found out how he got money out of the country. The bank accounts that he used. There were a lot of specific details that you could learn about how people in the Yanukovych circle during the Yanukovych regime operated, and how they siphoned cash away from the Ukrainian people into offshore accounts all over the world. That's something that we all learned. And the one thing that I think Paul Manafort did from the perspective of the American people is that he brought a lot of that experience that he had here to the United States when he became Donald Trump's campaign chairman. We have him to thank for Donald Trump becoming the Republican nominee in the election, because he was the campaign manager during the time when Donald Trump was named the candidate. And so we have Paul Manafort to thank in a lot of ways for Donald Trump's presidency. And I think he used a lot of the sort of political tricks that he honed here the sort of divisive wedge issues that he used with Yanukovych, he deployed them as well in the United States and helped the candidacy of Donald Trump. So, that's the other consequence.
Still, a lot of American journalists are trying to, not that often already come to Ukraine, but when there was the trial started, trying to find kind of where are the links to the Kremlin, where are the links to the Kremlin, to find something else about Manafort. So what I think are still the missing links in this story? Because for us, it's like we have the limit to what we can say. We say, Manafort here had done all the worst things you could imagine. In the end, the president he was supporting is accused of mass murder. What else? What worse should have happened? Still, of course, I think that there is a kind of the will to find some connection to the Kremlin via Manafort and his connection to the Russian oligarchs.
Well, the connection between Trump and the people around him to Russia isn't just through Manafort and Manafort's connection to Russian oligarchs who are close to Vladimir Putin. There are much more direct links that go through the Trump organization and their efforts to build the Trump Tower in Moscow that were taking place during the political campaign. I think, as a Ukraine-focused journalist, maybe there's a desire to look at the Trump-Russia connections through the prism of Paul Manafort because he played such an important role here. But you'll have a much easier time finding those links if you shift the focus to people like Felix Sater and Michael Cohen and other members and the Trump children, of course, members of the Trump organization who were directly involved in negotiations with various Russian officials about promoting their business in Russia. I think that's really where the real connections lie. The question that hasn't been answered yet is about collusion, and I think that's something that we're going to find out more from the Mueller investigation. So I think the question of were there links between Trump and Russia, that question has been answered. And the question that hasn't, and that's a yes. And then the question that hasn't been answered is, did Donald Trump collude with the Russians to steal the election from Hillary Clinton? That's the one that a court is going to have to decide.
Simon, and final, very general, of course. These are exactly the days we're talking here. It's exactly the days that 5 years ago we had the annexation of Crimea. The whole spring we would remember, how the war in the East unrolled. For you personally, what was this experience? What have you learned as a professional, as a person? Because of course, obviously, for people who've been there was something pretty dramatic.
Well, that's a big question to ask because, the last 5 years of my life have been so tied into the events of Ukraine because I feel like I was almost a participant in these events. It's sort of, for 2 years of my life at least, it took over. So what has this experience taught me? I don't know.
I'll give you a kind of a hint because, for instance, for a lot of people now understanding, for instance, what's happening at home in the US or in the West, it becoming easier after you kind of worked here.
I guess there were fewer surprises about the way that misinformation could spread for people who covered the war in Ukraine. But I can't say that helped us stop it. So even if we recognized some of the same things that were happening during the 2016 campaigns as echoes of what was happening in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, it was something that was too big for any group of journalists to be able to highlight and put a stop to it. I feel like a lot of times societies only learn about something once it's too late. And ringing alarm bells usually isn't enough, unfortunately.
Still, we are here to do that. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks a lot for visiting the chat. So that was Simon Ostrovsky, an American reporter currently working for PBS here in Ukraine, but famous for his reports for Vice News during the time of the start of the war in Ukraine. And that was the Sunday show. I would encourage you to also remember that we are here working for you 24/7 on our webpage en.hromadske.ua, also on our social media, Facebook and Twitter. Search Hromadske International, sign up for our newsletter. So there is way more to read if you would like to have a nuanced explanation, especially prior to the elections in Ukraine. And thanks for watching.